Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to really unpack a complex topic by looking at a whole range of sources.
That's right. We take all this information, distill it down, and give you the key insights.
And today, we're tackling the anthropological and sociological study of religion. We've got academic journals, bits from books, even some blog posts.
Yeah, a real mix. We're looking at it from all sorts of angles: sociological, cognitive science, anthropology, even Marxist and Weberian perspectives.
Our mission really is to pull out the crucial ideas about what religion is and, how it works in the world. We want to make it clear and engaging for you, the listener.
Exactly. If you're curious, if you want to get up to speed on complex stuff without getting bogged down, this is for you. We're aiming for those aha moments.
We want to synthesize all these different views to give you a clear picture of religion's role, both socially and personally.
Absolutely. Think of it as connecting the dots between these different ways of thinking about something so fundamental to human experience.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with the basics, like how do we even define religion and this idea of the sacred?
Good starting point. A lot of the sources bring up Durkheim, Emile Durkheim. He saw religion as fundamentally collective, tied to the group, the community.
The church, he called it, but not necessarily a building, right?
Yeah.
More like the community of believers.
Precisely. The community. And for him, the absolute core of it was this distinction he made between the sacred and the profane.
Ah, yes, the sacred versus the profane. Can you unpack that a little? What's the key difference?
Well, simply put, the sacred is anything that's set apart, special, powerful, maybe even forbidden, treated with reverence.
Okay, and the profane.
That's just everyday life. Ordinary stuff. Mundane reality. And Durkheim argued this division, this sharp line, is essential. You can't really have religion without it.
Right, it's a fundamental split in how things are perceived.
Exactly, an irreducible dichotomy, as the sources put it.
Now, here's where it gets, I think, really fascinating. Durkheim said the power of the sacred doesn't come from, outer space or some deity directly,
But from the social group itself,
Yeah.
yes. He argued that the feeling of power, the awe you feel towards the sacred, is actually the feeling of the group's power over the individual.
society itself is the source.
That was his argument. Society is this force, it's bigger than us, it existed before us, it'll exist after us, we depend on it.
So all these things, the community, the family, the nation, they become symbolized.
Right. Through names, flags, totems in some societies, stories, songs, dances, and, of course, gods. These are all symbols of social realities.
So when people worship these symbols, they're actually
celebrating the group,
yeah.
recognizing their own collective identity and power. It's society representing itself, worshiping itself in a way.
That is quite a perspective shift. The god of the clan can therefore be nothing else than the clan itself, personified.
Exactly that quote. The totemic principle is the clan imagined. So religion, at its core, is society reflecting on itself.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Anthropology offers a slightly different angle, right? Describing religion as an extrapolation of culture to the ultimate. What's that getting at?
Well, it highlights how deeply embedded religion is within the whole cultural system. It's not separate. And crucially, the beings or forces in religions, spirits, gods, whatever, they're almost always seen as social.
Social, even when they're like nature spirits or ancestors.
Yes. They're treated as having qualities of persons or agents. You can have a relationship with them. You communicate. They have intentions. There's reciprocity.
So we interact with ancestors, spirits, gods, even impersonal forces, almost as if they're part of the social world.
Pretty much. The anthropological view suggests we extend our social understanding, our ways of relating to these non-human entities. They become part of the social landscape.
Interesting. So the subject might be different from politics, say, but the way we engage is still fundamentally social.
That's a good way to put it. It's using our social toolkit to interact with the non-material world.
Okay, now for a completely different approach, cognitive science of religion. What's their starting point?
Well, first off, they tend to reject the idea that religion is totally unique, this sui generis thing that can't be studied scientifically.
So they think we can study it like any other cultural thing, like art or language.
Exactly. They operate under what's called methodological naturalism.
Methodological naturalism, meaning?
Meaning you look for natural explanations. You don't just accept a religious explanation like God did it as the scientific answer. You look for the cognitive or evolutionary mechanisms behind the belief or practice.
Right. And they bring in evolution and how our brains are wired, don't they?
Heavily. The idea is that our minds aren't blank slates. The way our brains evolve, the cognitive capacities we all share, shapes the kinds of cultural forms, including religious ones, that tend to stick around.
So they're looking for the underlying reasons why certain religious ideas or patterns keep popping up across different cultures.
Precisely. What are the universal mental factors, the cognitive biases or tendencies that might make humans predisposed to things like believing in supernatural agents or participating in rituals? They want the causal mechanisms.
Okay, let's circle back to Durkheim for a moment, specifically on social dynamics. He argued religion creates social solidarity, right? It binds people.
Yes, absolutely. He saw rituals as key here. Participating together in rituals reinforces those shared feelings, those collective sentiments we talked about. It upholds the group's values.
But then Max Weber comes along with a bit of a counterpoint.
Right. Weber said, hang on, religion isn't always about keeping things the same. It can be a major force for change.
It's like the Protestant Reformation.
That was his prime example. He argued certain Protestant beliefs created an ethic that was incredibly conducive to the development of capitalism. So religious ideas actually drove massive social and economic transformation.
So religion can be both conservative and revolutionary, depending on the context.
Exactly. It's not just one thing. It interacts with society in really complex ways.
Durkheim also had that concept of effervescence, that intense feeling during rituals.
Ah, yes, effervescence. Think of the feeling in a crowd at a concert or a huge political rally. That shared excitement, that energy.
Yeah.
Durkheim saw something similar in religious rituals, a kind of psychological force generated by the collective gathering. It makes people feel connected, united, maybe even highly suggestible.
And this reinforces their commitment to the group.
That was the idea. In that heightened state, you feel the power of the collective, your individual boundaries might seem to dissolve a bit, and your commitment to the shared values gets, well, recharged.
Let's talk about belief. It seems so central, but some anthropologists really question our assumptions about it. Spiro, for instance, warned against assuming everyone in a group believes the same thing in the same way.
That's a really important caution. Just because there's a stated doctrine or a religious expert doesn't mean every single person understands or experiences that belief identically. There's room for individual variation.
And then Needham went even further, questioning if belief itself is even a universal psychological state.
Right. He argued that what we call belief in English, especially in the West, might not map neatly onto psychological states or concepts in other cultures. The very idea might be culturally specific.
The sources break down belief in English into different senses, don't they? Like believing that something is true versus believing in someone like trust versus believing in something like commitment to a value.
Exactly. Propositional belief, trust or confidence, and commitment or value. And these can be bundled together or kept separate in different languages and religious systems.
So our typical Western, maybe Christian-influenced way of thinking about belief, mixing fact, trust, value isn't the only way.
Definitely not. Many religious traditions don't have formal creeds in the same way, or they might emphasize orthopraxy, correct practice, over orthodoxy, correct belief.
Oh.
The history of the word belief itself in the West shows how it shifted from trust to propositions to personal experience. That's a specific cultural trajectory.
Okay, moving on to spirits and gods. What's the basic common ground there?
Well, the fundamental thing is they're usually seen as individuals. They have minds, wills, personalities. There's agency involved.
But there's a spectrum, right, from spirits to gods.
Yeah, Levy, Maggio, and Howard suggest thinking about it as a continuum, distinguished by a few things, like structure gods often tied to big social institutions, spirits more marginal.
Okay.
What else? Personhood gods often seem more fully human in their social nature. Spirits may be more fluid or minimally persons. Experience, interestingly, spirits are often encountered more directly than gods in everyday life.
Really? That's counterintuitive.
It can seem that way. And finally, morality. Gods are usually tied to the moral order, maybe even enforcing it. Spirits can be morally ambiguous, outside the main system, sometimes even seen as evil or just causing trouble.
So gods are sort of the establishment figures concerned with the big picture, and spirits are more like local agents, maybe unpredictable.
That's a decent way to think about it. Gods provide the model for order. Spirits often represent threats to it or things operating outside it.
And this ties into ideas about misfortune and what happens after death, right? The Burmese example with different kinds of ghosts.
Yes, it shows the variety. Beliefs about the afterlife, what happens to the soul or spirit, are incredibly diverse. Sometimes the dead remain involved, sometimes benignly, sometimes causing problems, like the Tessie or Thay ghosts mentioned.
And when bad things happen, people don't always blame a high god. Sometimes it's ancestors or even other humans, witches, sorcerers, like the Azande example.
Right. Attribution of misfortune is complex. It can be spirits, gods, human malice, or even just bad luck or the nature of things, like dukkha, suffering, in Buddhism. Or think of the ancient Greek gods often portrayed as pretty arbitrary and not necessarily concerned with human justice.
Let's talk symbols and language. Joseph Campbell's idea that religious symbols point beyond themselves to mystery. God is not a fact.
Yeah, Campbell emphasizes the transcendent, unnameable quality that symbols evoke. But then you have someone like Dan Sperber who questions if that search for deep, hidden meaning is universal or more of a Western intellectual habit. Maybe symbolism is more straightforwardly cultural.
So is the meaning inherent, or do we impose it? A classic debate.
It is, and religious language isn't just myths and stories, right?
No, definitely not. Prayer, incantations, songs, proverbs, liturgy, loads of different forms.
And we need to think about not just the content, what the words say, but the performance, how it's said, sung, chanted, in what context.
Right. The meaning isn't just in the text. Myth itself, the source is defined as a sacred narrative, often about origins or supernatural beings, a subgenre of folklore.
And crucially, often existing as oral literature. It lives in the telling, in the performance. So analyzing just the plot or structure might miss a lot.
Which brings us back to action. Religion isn't just thinking, it's doing. Malinowski's point, it's a mode of action.
Absolutely fundamental. Ritual is where belief gets enacted.
Right.
And rituals are often really complex performances. Multi-part, multimedia.
What do you mean multimedia?
Well, they involve language, but also maybe dance, music, special clothing, masks, specific gestures, silence, handling sacred objects, eating special foods. It's a whole sensory experience often.
And they have recurring features like
Action, definitely. Patterning, they follow a set structure, often highly formalized. Repetition is key. And communication, though, as Catherine Bell notes, sometimes the communicative aspect isn't obvious, or maybe it's even felt to be empty by some participants. But the form is still important. Formality, fixity, repetition, those are hallmarks.
And Durkheim saw ritual as the place where commitment happens, where that effervescence reinforces the social bonds.
Exactly. Ritual is the process of representing and recommitting to those social facts, those collective values. It's where society strengthens itself emotionally.
Now, clearly, religion changes. It's not static. Even traditional ones evolve.
Oh, absolutely. The sources talk about religious fields where different ideas and practices are constantly interacting and influencing each other. And in modern times, with faster communication and cultural mixing, that change often accelerates.
And we see new religious movements, NRMs popping up. There are ways to categorize them.
Yeah, Wallace looked at how they relate to the outside world. Are they rejecting it, affirming it, or just accommodating it? Anthony and others looked at their response to cultural norms, dualistic, seeing good versus evil, or monistic, seeing an underlying unity.
So different strategies for relating to the mainstream.
Right, and you have things like cult movements forming around specific beliefs and rituals, sometimes becoming new sects or churches.
And revitalization movements. Those sound interesting.
They often emerge in times of great stress or rapid change when the old ways just don't seem to work anymore. There's a mismatch between beliefs and reality. So these movements try to create a new, more satisfying cultural system. The Vaila madness in Papua is cited as an example, a response to colonial impact.
Okay. What about the big world religions? Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. The sources say they aren't really monolithic.
Not at all. That's a key takeaway. They look very different on the ground in different places. Think of Christianity in Brazil versus, say, South Korea. It's better to see them as huge umbrellas covering countless local variations and adaptations. They're constantly interacting with local cultures.
And when people convert, it's not always about suddenly agreeing with all the doctrines.
Often not. Motivations are really diverse. It could be a powerful personal experience, finding the moral values appealing, seeing practical advantages, maybe social pressure, or the prestige associated with the new religion. It's complex.
So world religions meet local contexts, and you get syncretism, adaptation, all sorts of outcomes.
Exactly. They are dynamic assortments of multifarious local things, constantly changing.
Now, the tricky topic of religion and violence. The sources seem careful here.
Yes, the aim isn't to take sides or make sweeping judgments, but they do push back against simple views. It's not all violent, but it's also not true that authentic religion is never violent.
The relationship is complex.
Very. And religious violence isn't just one thing, like terrorism. It can take many forms. Internal conflicts, persecution, sacrifice in some historical contexts.
There's that interesting point from Gluckman that sometimes internal conflict can actually be integrative, keep society from splitting completely along one line.
Yeah, the idea that crisscrossing conflicts can actually prevent society from fracturing entirely. It diffuses tension, maybe.
And we see violence attributed to human agents again, witches, sorcerers, and sacrifice, even human sacrifice historically linked to feeding gods or establishing power.
It underlines that violence has been intertwined with religious practice and belief in many different, sometimes disturbing ways throughout history. It can be about maintaining order, explaining misfortune, or demonstrating power.
Okay, on the flip side, secularism. A lot of people identify as non-religious now.
A significant chunk of the global population, yes. Secularization theory tried to explain this as an inevitable decline of religion with modernity, but it's proven much more complex than that.
How so?
Well, secularism itself looks different in different places. Western secularism isn't the same as, say, secularism in Turkey, or how traditionally non-theistic groups like the Basri operate. And even in religious societies like Japan with Shinto, there's a kind of functional secularism in many areas of life.
And we even see new movements without gods, like Raelianism. The lines are blurry.
Definitely. Plus, there's a more organized contemporary secular movement. It challenges simple definitions of religion and non-religion.
Then there's fundamentalism, often seen as a reaction against the modern world.
That's a common characteristic. A reactive style, often feeling at war with the world or trying to resist perceived threats from secularism or other religions. It emphasizes a return to perceived fundamentals.
But it's not always violent.
No, the reactions vary. It can be about strict moral purity or separating peacefully from the wider society. But sometimes, yes, it is associated with violence, like the Christian identity movement example.
And it happens across different religions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jewish Hasidism trying to preserve a way of life against modernity, Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka reacting to perceived threats. It's a cross-cultural pattern of resisting change and clinging to a specific version of the past or core principles.
Let's bring in Marx, opium of the people. How should we understand that?
Well, the common interpretation, and one the sources touch on, is therapeutic. Religion provides comfort, solace, hope for a better afterlife, especially for those suffering under oppression in this life.
It dulls the pain of reality.
It can be seen that way. Marx called it the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world. So it acknowledges the real suffering it addresses, even as he saw it as ultimately illusory, an imagined ideal world.
But there are critiques of this view, or alternative takes.
Yes. Some argue religion isn't always passive. It can be an amphetamine, energizing people for action, sometimes manipulated for political ends. Others argue that attempts to eradicate religion, like in some Marxist states, led to even worse oppression. Maybe religion acts as a bulwark against extremism sometimes.
And Marx linked religion to alienation.
Yes, he saw it arising from the alienation experienced in capitalist production, being separated from the product of your labor, from the work itself, from your own human nature, species being, and from other people. Religion offers a kind of projected solution to this real-world alienation. Private property itself, for Marx, was a consequence of this alienated labor.
Okay, deep breath. Let's turn to Weber's sociology of religion. He talked about spirits and demons persisting even in monotheism.
Right. Weber noted that even when you have one high god, the belief in lesser spirits, demons, ghosts, etc. often remains very powerful in everyday practice. People still worried about them, tried to appease them or ward them off. Monotheism didn't just erase them practically.
And he tracked how gods evolved, often linked to political centers, and how sacrifice changed.
Yeah, he saw sacrifice moving from something maybe seen as magical coercion, forcing the god's hand towards becoming more like tribute or atonement, showing submission, reflecting a changing, perhaps more hierarchical view of the divine. The do des idea, I give so that you might give.
Weber also focused on the role of the priesthood.
Huge role. He saw priests as specialists managing the religious enterprise, distinct from magicians who might use coercion. Priests helped rationalize beliefs, develop ethics, create dogma, systematic theology.
Contrasted with prophets.
Yes, prophets were more like individual, charismatic figures bringing new revelations or divine commands, often challenging the priestly establishment. Weber also noted how the care of souls by priests became a powerful instrument influencing people's daily lives.
And different social classes relate to religion differently.
Absolutely. Weber looked at how merchants, warriors, intellectuals, peasants, they all might have different religious needs and orientations. He explored the tensions between rational economic activity and traditional religious ethics, and looked at world-rejecting asceticism, like in Buddhism, as a rational path to liberation from suffering.
Okay, almost there. One source looked at religion and the evolution of cooperation, the idea that certain kinds of gods helped humans cooperate in bigger groups.
Yes, the hypothesis is that believing in moralistic gods, gods who care about how humans treat each other, who know what you do, and who punish wrongdoing, might have helped curb selfish biases and enabled cooperation beyond just close family.
And there's experimental evidence.
The study mentioned looked across diverse societies: Fiji, Tanzania, Mauritius, Siberia, Vanuatu, Brazil. They found participants generally favored themselves and local co-religionists, as you might expect. But belief in gods who were seen as moralistic, punishing, and knowledgeable correlated with less of that bias, especially the punishing aspect.
So the fear of supernatural punishment might have been a key factor in scaling up cooperation.
That's what the evidence suggests, more so than just being watched, apparently.
Finally, there's archaeological evidence for really ancient rituals back in the Neolithic.
Yeah, sites in Anatolia like Göbekli Tepe, dating back 11,000 years or more, evidence of large ceremonial structures, public rituals suggesting shaman-like practices and communal rites were happening very early on. And Neolithic art starts showing complex ideas about humans, animals, and the supernatural.
So religion, or at least ritual and engagement with the supernatural, goes way, way back.
Deep roots. Seems fundamental to human societies for millennia.
Wow. Okay, that was a whirlwind tour through a lot of complex ideas. So
Yeah.
to try and wrap up, religion is clearly this incredibly multifaceted thing.
Absolutely. You need all these lenses: sociology, anthropology, cognitive science, history, economics, to even begin to grasp its role in society, belief, behavior, conflict.
And core concepts we think are simple, like belief or the sacred or even gods, are actually understood and experienced very differently across cultures and disciplines. They're not fixed.
Definitely one of the big aha moments. Seeing the social construction of the sacred, the huge range of reasons people engage in religious practice, the fact that it's always changing and adapting.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. How can understanding these different perspectives, the social functions, the cognitive roots, the historical shifts, the economic links, help us make sense of the religious world today?
Yeah, and how does it change how we think about our own beliefs, or lack thereof? And maybe, just maybe, help us understand people with very different beliefs a little better in this incredibly diverse world.
Something to chew on. We hope this deep dive has given you a solid foundation for thinking about these questions and maybe exploring specific traditions further.